Okay, great. I guess it's my turn then. I will I will share my screen so that you can see. I have a few slides. And what I thought I would do today is give a really brief uh, introduction to some of the science, some of which is going on at Penn, looking at how babies start learning language. And from a scientific perspective, we like to start from the baby, right? And everyone who spent time with a baby knows a lot about how babies behave and how they've seen language starting in babies. Scientists often talk about babies in the first few months as being pre-linguistic. And what they mean by that is they're not saying a lot of sentences, right? They're not talking the way that we are. That word, which to many of us sounds downright derogatory, comes from the fact that children are not speaking in sentences. Uh, and what you see when you observe children is that they vocalize, of course, right from the beginning, right? They're crying and they're burping and making vegetative noises of various sorts and so on. Um, they uh, they may start. Whoops, I'm having a little trouble with the screen sharing. I'm going to pause this just for a second and screen share again. Okay, so so we see a kind of progression that's fairly typical in the first year, where children will start making long vowel sounds, will start cooing around 3 months. By about 6 to 9 months, kids will start doing what's called canonical babbling, which is producing syllables, saying things like ba, 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 da, da, da. These get a little more complicated over time. Instead of just repeating the same syllable, kids will start varying the syllable that they're producing. And then around 10 to 13 months, kids will have this magic moment where they start talking about things in recognizable ways, where they seem to be referring to things out in the world. So if you're a casual observer of a child, or if your neighbors are watching your baby, these are the sorts of things that kids will observe. Now, as scientists trying to understand what kids are doing, we watch this behavior too. Here's an example of a baby, and I just took this off YouTube. It's an example of some babble. Kids seem to do this all the time. They're not tired of it. And we can ask, what on earth are they doing? What is the mental image they have in mind that they're trying to match when they engage in this kind of behavior? If we want to understand what they're thinking about, a good place for us to start, I think, is just listening carefully to the way that parents talk to their children and imagining what that might be like for the baby. So here's an example of some maternal speech. This is to a 3-month-old.
Man ser inte ögonen så bra. Man får titta lite från sidan så här. Vi tittar lite på Dappa också. Där kan han kika på dig. Hej Dante! Vi tittar på Koka också. Ja, det var Koka med nosen och öronen. Öronen som kunde vara tjo, tjo. Va? Har du sett? Och så man kunde göra så här.
So that's an example. I don't know if you recognize the language. That's a mother talking in Swedish to her baby. There are a few things that we notice about this. One is that it's very intimate. She's speaking right next to the face of her baby. You can kind of hear that in listening to her and listening to the baby responding. Another is that there are a few elements that are a little bit unusual from the perspective of, say, adult conversation. You can tell that this is an unusual form of speech. There's a little bit of sound effect going on, but also she's speaking in real sentences and she's not really slowing it down. The way that she's talking here does not sound like, say, day one of 8th grade Spanish class, right? She's having a real conversation. So if you're that 3-month-old, what are you thinking about what's going on? 3-month-olds see adults interacting all the time, and all the time they're doing this kind of funny, noisy breathing. So if you're a baby, you're wondering, what does it mean? Of course, we as scientists have asked what they're getting out of it. And one of the things that we've known since the 80s and 90s is that one of the things that babies are getting out of this speech is they're learning their particular language's set of consonants and vowels. They're learning their language's speech sounds. And that's true independently of whether they're able to say them. They're learning to hear them. How do we know that? Well, it turns out you can find out a lot about what babies know by making them bored. So here's how this works when you're trying to figure out what they know about speech. You set up the baby in a situation where as long as they look at the screen, they get to hear something. So let's say when they're looking away, they hear nothing. And then when they look at the screen, you play for them something like ba, 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 ba. And they look away, they hear nothing. And they look at the screen, they start hearing ba. Babies love this. They love being able to control something in the world, but they don't love it forever. It's a little bit boring. So over time, they will first enjoy the sound and they'll look at the screen for it. But if you measure how long they're looking, over time, that will start to decrease because they're just hearing the same thing over and over again. What we do is when that decrease has occurred, then we change the sound. And the expectation is if they notice the change, then they're looking at the screen will rebound again because it shows that, oh, they've noticed something is new, something different is being offered here at this time. So by doing that, we can play a sound like ba and a sound like da and see if they respond to the change from one to the other. So starting in the 80s, scientists did a bunch of this. And what they found is an interesting developmental pattern. If you look at kids from about 0 to 6 months, they will respond to clear instances of pretty much any language's sounds. So they'll respond to a difference from b to p, from t to d, from u to u, from o to on. If there's a language that makes a distinction, the babies at this age will also notice that difference. There are a few exceptions, but mostly this is the pattern. Things start to change between 6 and 12 months. You start seeing children responding only to the sounds that are in their language. So to give you an example, there have been studies done looking at children who are learning Spanish. Spanish has 5 vowels, a, e, I, o, and u. There's a neighboring language, Catalan, which has a couple of extra vowels that Spanish doesn't have, including the distinction between e and a bit like the English words bet and bait. 4-month-old Spanish learners will distinguish the Catalan e from e. But by 6 or 8 months, these kids can't hear that distinction anymore, or they don't respond to that distinction anymore because they're homing in on just the sounds that are necessary for Spanish. So we know that this is going on across the course of the first year. We don't really know how it works, but we know that it's data driven, right? You learn the language that you're exposed to. If you hear enough of a language, then that's the one you're going to connect to as a baby. There's a little bit of evidence that suggests that there's also a maturational component. So for example, babies who are born slightly premature don't then learn language structure at a slightly earlier age, even though they have the same amount of data as someone who's born a little bit later. So it appears there's a maturational component. We also know that there's a maturational component at the other end. Babies are much better at learning language sounds than adults are. If you've ever tried to learn a language as an adult, one of the things that's most difficult about that is differentiating the subtle sound distinctions that are made in that language if they're not also made in your language. This can be quite difficult for adults, but it seems to be much easier for babies. Another question that we've been asking is whether these early young infants know the meanings of words. When we're talking to them, do they understand anything that we're saying, or is it just kind of like noise? One of the ways that we've evaluated this is by using infants' looking behavior. So we can present children with a series of picture pairs and name one of them. So in this study, which I did with Elika Bergelsen, who was a PhD student at Penn, we had parents sit with their baby on their lap looking at a computer monitor where we would show a couple of objects. So we might have an apple, or in this case, a picture of a mouth. And we prompt the mom over the phone, or sorry, over the headphones to say, where's the apple? And then she says, where's the apple? And we monitor where the baby is looking. And what we want to know is whether kids look more at the apple when we say apple than when we say mouth. Here is some data from that study. What you see on the x-axis is children's age, how old they are in months. And on the y-axis, we see how much more they look at the picture that we name compared to when we don't name that picture. What we can see is that over developmental time, kids in general are looking more at the named picture, or more at a particular picture when we name it than when we use the alternative label. Even children at about 6 to 8 months were looking more at the named picture. Then we saw a pretty steady performance, and then somewhere around 12 or 13 months, kids started suddenly performing much, much better in the task. This was all a big surprise to us. We did not expect, and no one else either expected, that kids as young as 6 months would be understanding some of our words. We expected that we would see a gradual increase from about 6 or 7 months. Here's a video showing what that looks like from the eye tracker. The green dot is where the child is looking.
Do you see the ear?
You see right after the word ear, children start, this child, this is one example, quickly shifted their gaze over to look at the ear and then returned to looking at the eyes on the picture. Here's another example of this. Oops.
Look at the bottle.
So the child hears look at the bottle and then starts looking directly at the bottle. Once we found this, we wanted to know whether this was true just of words for things or if it was true of other kinds of words too. So we had little movies, and here they would be hearing words like hi, or all gone, or eat, or hug. What we found with these words for more abstract things is that it took children a little bit longer to show recognition of them. So when we looked again at the 6 to 9 month olds, there were just as many kids, or almost as many kids, who were looking less at the picture than looking more at it when it was named. By the time kids got to be 10 to 13 months, then they were performing higher than you'd expect by chance. And by 14 to 16 month olds, kids' performance was quite solid, even on these words that are not for objects, but are for more abstract things like verbs or greetings. When we look at the particular items, you can see that at 6 to 9 months, there's not much going on. By 10 to 13 months, they're at least above 0 on most of the items. They're performing extremely well on kiss and dance, which is fascinating. And then by 14 to 16 months, they're recognizing basically all of the words that we tested them on. So to wrap up, I mean, this has been a pretty quick little overview of just a couple of experiments, but we found that infants learn a couple of different kinds of thing at the same time in the first year. They've learned things about which sounds matter in their language, and they've learned a little bit about what the words mean. This isn't all they learn about language in the first couple of years, but it's a couple of things that have been most heavily studied. Another more general conclusion is that babies know more about language than they're telling you. Their ability to understand things and to start to grasp the structure of language exceeds their ability to talk. So what that means is that as parents, we need to be the ones leading the way. We don't need to follow what they do. We can lead the way. And the best way to do this seems to be to talk to kids, to talk to the infants, even if they're not really responding, talking to them and engaging them as legitimate conversational partners seems to be helpful. So talking about the sorts of things that they're interested in can be helpful in promoting some of these early language developments. All right. That's all I had as a kind of formal presentation. So I'll wrap up my part there and stop sharing my screen, and we'll move on from there. Thanks.
Alrighty, and then I will step in and share my screen. Let's see if we can get that going. All right. So just let me know if you have any trouble seeing it. So again, my name is Kate Bouser. I'm a speech language pathologist at CHOP. So Dan did a great job of giving us a quick overview of the science of what we know about early language development, especially in those quote unquote pre-linguistic months. So I'm going to switch gears and approach this from a slightly different lens as a clinical speech language pathologist. I want to chat a little bit more about what you can expect for speech and language development kind of after those pre-linguistic months, and also how you as parents and caregivers can support it. So the first thing that I want to highlight is the difference between speech and language. So these are two terms that we often use interchangeably, but they really refer to two different things, and it's important to distinguish them. So the simplest way to put it is when we talk about speech, we're talking about the sound of the message, and we talk about language, we're thinking more about content. And so taking a closer look at that, when we think about speech, we think about articulation, which is how speech sounds are made, actually pronouncing the sounds of our speech. We think about our voice, what our voice sounds like, the pitch, the volume, how air is moving through our vocal tract. And we think about fluency, which is the rhythm and flow of speech, how speech flows forward. Just as a frame of reference, when we think about like a disorder of fluency, we would be thinking about something like stuttering. Then when we think about language, we're thinking about our receptive language. So what a child is understanding, or at least able to demonstrate that they're understanding, what they are expressing. So how they're using vocabulary and grammar to communicate with other people. And then also their pragmatic language, which is how they're using language to interact socially with other people. There's a lot of resources out there to give you a sense of what developmental expectations are. And there is a wide range of what is considered normal at different ages of development. But I wanted to give you a resource that we can trust, that's from a trusted source. So I believe this will be linked in the resources that you have. It's also in these slides. But this is from ASHA, which is our national organization, and it outlines speech and language expectations for children from birth to age 5. So you can always take a closer look at that. I won't spend too much time going through each individual age because there really is so much to talk about. But briefly, I just wanted to give you a sense that we have expectations for what a child is understanding and responding to, how they identify things, how they follow directions. We also have expectations for how they use language, their vocabulary, how they're putting words together, also how they're using words to interact with other people. And then as we're heading into the later toddler and preschool years, you can see that we expect the language that they're understanding and using to just continue to become more and more complex. And they start to use their language for more complex purposes. So things like being able to have a conversation or tell a story or share an experience. We also have expectations for a child's speech. Again, thinking back to the difference between speech and language. So if you've ever heard a child starting to talk, if your own children are starting to speak, you've probably noticed that their speech doesn't sound like an adult's speech. They often have errors or patterns in their speech that we expect them to outgrow as they get older. So on the left here is a general guideline for when we expect English-speaking children to properly use different sounds. So for example, if you have a 3-year-old who's having a hard time saying an R sound or a TH sound, that's probably developmentally okay, because those are sounds that we expect children to acquire later on. And also, as children use more mature speech, they also get easier to understand. So when a child is 2 years old, it's developmentally acceptable if you only understand about 50% of what they say. And if you've spent some time around toddlers, you know sometimes you don't have a clue what they're saying to you. But as they get older, their speech should become clearer and clearer to you as their caregiver. So by 3, you understand about 3/4 of what they say. And by 4, you should understand just about all of what they're saying. So the reason these milestones are important and we use them is because they're a guide to help us determine if a closer look is needed. If a child is not meeting their milestones, then it might be worth it for them to see a speech language pathologist and undergo an evaluation. There's some other reasons why an evaluation might be warranted. So if a child has a medical diagnosis that is known to be associated with speech and language delays, so for example, if they have hearing loss, if they have autism spectrum disorder, it's probably a good idea for them to at least be monitored by a speech language pathologist. Also, anytime there's a loss of skills, we really don't ever expect a child to lose developmental skills. So, if a child had several words that they were producing and then they suddenly stopped using those, that would be potentially a cause for concern. Or if there's just changes in their presentation. So if they suddenly begin to stutter, or if there's suddenly a change in their voice, those would be other reasons why potentially seeing a speech language pathologist would be appropriate. And then I think most importantly, really anytime a parent or caregiver is concerned about child's speech and language development, that in itself is reason enough to seek out some guidance. We as clinical therapists have a pretty low bar for when we would want to take a closer look. And really the reason for that is we know that children who get started earlier with early intervention services tend to have the best outcomes for their development, not only in their speech and language, but also in things like their academic skills or their social skills down the line. And so we really don't want to miss anything, and we want to make sure that we're catching these issues early on if we can. All right, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time touching on some common roadblocks that we hear as speech language pathologists, myths or misconceptions that are out there. These are sometimes comments that come from someone that's well-meaning, a pediatrician or maybe grandma or maybe a neighbor, or everybody's had that experience of talking to a cashier that seems to offer unsolicited parenting advice. So I wanted to go through a few of these things and discuss a little bit of the research behind them. So anytime that I'm speaking to a group of parents or caregivers, the question of speaking multiple languages always comes up. Many people have a misconception that bilingualism or multilingualism causes a language delay. And we know if you look at a bilingual child's vocabulary in one single language, it might be smaller than average. But if you combine their total vocabulary in both languages, it should be the same size as a typically developing child who is monolingual. So for example, if a child is learning to speak both Mandarin and English, if you combine both their Mandarin vocabulary and their English vocabulary together, it should be an average size. So really being exposed to multiple languages shouldn't be confusing for a child, and it shouldn't cause a language delay. We also frequently hear that a child's speech is delayed because they're a second child. There's no research to suggest that. There's differences in birth order in how a child's language develops. And we also often hear the idea that a child is a boy and that's why they're delayed. So on this one, there's a little bit of a distinction to make. So it's true that girls tend to acquire language on the earlier end of average, and boys tend to acquire it on the later end of average, but they should still be hitting their milestones within the average range of what we expect. So if a boy is not meeting typical language milestones, he likely has a language delay, so falling outside of what we typically expect for language development, and that would be worth taking a closer look at. We also know that boys are at higher risk for having speech and language disorders and also other developmental disabilities, so it makes it even more important that we're catching those things early on. Families often hear that a child will grow out of a delay, or that we should just kind of wait and see how they develop. It is true that there are some children who we would call late talkers, who have early speech and language delays and then they catch up. But children who, out of all the children that have these early delays, about 50% of them don't catch up to their peers in a few years. And as I mentioned, early language delays place a child at risk for issues, especially with academics down the line, especially with literacy development. So again, if a parent is concerned, it's probably worth it to take a closer look through an evaluation rather than taking a wait and see approach. And then I just quickly wanted to comment on the idea of using other ways to communicate. This is really geared towards children who have some delays in their communication. So often if a child is not speaking or not speaking well, we might, as therapists, recommend using another way to communicate. So using basic signs or pictures. And some families are really reluctant because they're worried that it's going to hold a child back from talking, they'll become reliant on them. But there's really good research to show that using alternative systems like signs or a picture-based system does not hinder speech development. And especially for children who have developmental disabilities, there's some studies that show that it seems to actually support speech development, to give them other ways to communicate, to help serve as a bridge into speech development and kind of assist with their vocabulary growth. All right, so then there's just a few references there for some of those things that I was quickly touching base about. All right, so even if your child is typically developing, we still want to make sure that you're supporting their speech and language development. And children really don't learn by sitting down at a table and doing flashcards. They really learn language best by observing other people, experiencing things while an adult is modeling language for them or giving them language input. And you as parents and caregivers, I'm sure, are very busy and you don't have time to create these like elaborate learning opportunities. But the good news is kids really learn through things that you can do throughout the day. So these are just some examples for how you can incorporate language growth within routines that you're probably already doing. I won't spend too much time talking about each individual one, but just for the sake of an example, I can highlight bath time. Bath time is really a valuable opportunity. Sometimes it's the only time that a child and parent are together alone in an entire day. And you're in this natural position where you're kind of down on their level. There's not very many distractions. So this would be a natural opportunity to talk about vocabulary, body parts, where's your feet? Can we wash your face? It's also a great time to sing songs together. Children learn language and vocabulary through songs. It's a great way to incorporate that. There's also a lot of fun actions that happen when you're in the bath, splashing, pouring, washing. So you could describe what you're doing or what your child is doing. And as an added bonus, when you're in the bathroom, you're probably close to a mirror. So that would be a great opportunity to pop the child up so that they can see themselves and see you in the mirror. Looking in a mirror with an adult is a great time to work on imitation and just allowing a child to focus on your mouth and your face a little bit more. And so throughout all of these routines, there's a few kind of like speech therapist tricks that we might suggest, a few things that you can, a few strategies you can incorporate. So I just wanted to touch base on a few of those. So the biggest one is to follow the child's lead. Children, again, learn through play. And as Dan mentioned earlier, they learn based on what they're already paying attention to. So your best bet is to talk about what they're doing or what they're looking at, instead of trying to redirect them or trying to give them a lot of instructions. So if your child's already looking at or holding or playing with a ball, you might say something like, "You've got a red ball. I saw you kicked the ball. I wonder if you can throw the ball." I always say it kind of feels like you're just talking to yourself. And if you're doing that, if you're feeling that way, you're probably doing it right. Also a good idea to just try to limit the number of questions that you're asking the child. I think about how stressed I would be if I was trying to learn something new and someone was quizzing me, asking me questions constantly. So really, it's a good idea to focus on making comments instead. And a good rule of thumb is try to ask one question for every 2 or 3 comments that you're making. It's kind of a little reminder to yourself to take a step back from the quizzing. And on a related note, it's also important to try to focus more on basic everyday vocabulary instead of academic concepts. So what I mean by that is things like colors, shapes, letters, numbers. There's plenty of time in a child's life for them to learn those things. So when you're playing, I think it's a good idea to focus on those functional words, names of objects, action words, words to describe things, and take a step back from that more rote academic knowledge. Another good rule of thumb is to try to add a word to your child's statements. So this is modeling language that's just one step beyond what they're already doing independently. So if your child sees a dog and says, "Doggy," you could say, "Big doggy," or "Doggy's running." Or if they say, "Balloon up," you could say, "You're right, the balloon went up." So just kind of taking it one step beyond what they're currently doing, either by adding more complex grammar or new vocabulary into what they already said. Again, we also think a lot about your positioning when you're interacting with the child. So I think it's pretty common to be sitting next to your child or have them seated on your lap. But a good trick is to get down on their level and face them so that they can see your mouth and your face while you're speaking with them. And we also think about the types of toys that you're using. In general, we like toys that are a little bit more open-ended and give the child a chance to be more creative and interactive. So things like blocks, puzzles, dolls, pretend food, that sort of thing. If a toy does a lot for a child, like lighting up, making sounds, it can be pretty overwhelming, especially for young kids. It's also noisy, and it talks for them. It doesn't give them a chance to talk about what's happening. And the toy itself maybe only does one thing instead of letting them be more creative. And then I would just wrap up by saying probably the most important suggestion is to have fun. Again, children are learning through play, and the best thing that we can suggest is to have fun while you're playing with your child. Alrighty, so there's a few references, and I will stop sharing my screen.